Okay, we're reconvening our afternoon meeting and we're going to continue to explore issues in water. And our next witness is Jared Carpenter. Welcome back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all again. For the record, Jared Carpenter with the Lake Champlain Committee. I'm a little rusty. It's been, I think, probably the last time I testified was probably in this committee on something different. But the chair had asked me to come in along with John Groban from BNRC to talk about some of the water quality issues that are currently undergoing, that are on the radar of our organizations. One I will go into is the Lake Champlain TMDL. As the Lake Champlain Committee, obviously the Lake Champlain TMDL is something that we watch and follow very closely. But I was going to touch on a few issues and then turn it over to John. So I've been working on water quality issues for about 10 or 11 years now, not obviously nearly as long as Mike has, but probably all the way through the start of the TMDL. Actually, one of the first bills I worked on in this building was the shoreland protection provision. A lot of the bills that we have been working on and a lot of the provisions over the last 10 years, especially the TMDL, have been, and the funding have been related to water quality. The nutrient pollution from runoffs of impervious surfaces, agriculture, natural resources, impacts on aquatic biota, drinking water sources. It's in the last couple of years that we've really been starting to talk about water quantity issues, and how the two issues are interrelated is something that I've been looking at. Lake Champlain Committee has been looking at a lot more. Obviously, water quantity issues are, last year was a drought. 2 years before were a flood. And we seem to be in a dice roll of this coming year in 2026. Are we going to have another drought, or are we going to be back to a flood or some combination thereof? These issues are all interrelated. Water quantity issues do have impacts on drinking water supplies, on agriculture withdrawals, commercial use in the environment such as habitat. And they obviously have also impact water pollution as well. So I think it behooves this body to start looking at the interrelationship between water quality and water quantity and how they work together. Water quality issues, just to sort of level score us, I've talked about this last year. Vermont's economy relies heavily on tourism, people coming to enjoy the outdoors, lakes and the rivers. The Treasurer's report, Beth Pierce did back in 2017, is still one of the better reports on the impacts of water quality on our economy. Over 2.5 billion is spent annually by visitors and vacation homeowners, much of it linked to our lakes and rivers. 2023 studies that, 82.2 million in Vermont on RVing that year, 70.1 million in boating and fishing, 31 in hiking. And it's a lot of jobs and it's a lot of annual tourist expenditures. As a matter of fact, a solid portion of the Clean Water Fund is based off of that goes into a lot of these water quality projects and programs, comes from out of state dollars. I mean, there's the property transfer tax, clean water surcharge that we talked about last year, and that this committee actually bumped the sunset back and did a look in. I think it's every 4 or 5 years, looking at that as a main source of people not only buying first homes but buying second homes. And that is, let's see, for FY26, that's projected to be $9 million. Meals and rooms tax. We're all looking at the same one. Meals and rooms tax is another one. Actually, Vermonters spend more on the meals tax part, but obviously our visitors spend more on the rooms tax. And that is $16.26 million for FY26. So there's a lot of money that comes in and out that having to do with clean water. And that's the importance to the state to not lose sight of it in all the permits we talk about and all the requirements and all the nutrient pollution. At the end of the day, this is about having clean water for a lot of different reasons, and not the least of which is that phosphorus runoff feeds cyano blooms, not only on Lake Champlain, which is one of the photos, but we're starting to see it more and more in smaller lakes and rivers as well, of nutrient runoff affecting clean water, and especially with the warming of weather and causing cyanobacteria blooms. So over the last decade, Mike touched on a lot of these. There have been a number of statutes enacted that talk about water quality and quantity. Shoreland Protection Act, the two dealing with this, with Vermont Lake Champlain TMDL. Phosphorus is Act 64, Vermont Clean Water Act. Act 76, the Clean Water Service Provider Act. I'll go into those a little bit more, and so we're at about the midway point. And 2022 was a Surface Water Withdrawal Act, which passed through this committee, and then downstairs, which has to do with, just like it sounds, water withdrawals from surface waters. At the time in 22, we said, oh my, we're never going to see a drought in this state, and we're not going to have to worry about competition between water. Well, you know, I've had a couple of folks come up to me today and say, we need to talk about surface water withdrawals for, you know, ski areas, for agriculture, or all sorts of other folks that might be starting to compete with the surface water, and how much can you withdraw and how much do you leave in? Flood Safety Act, obviously this committee passed Act 121. And then last year, we'll just call it the CAFO Water Quality Permit Act, which I'm going to talk about a little bit as well. So the TMDL for phosphorus, TMDL, total maximum daily load, that was established in 2016 by the EPA as the budget for phosphorus entering Lake Champlain. In 2015, the year prior, was when Act 64 was passed, in order to set all the regulations and standards for the reductions. So this is the mic here. So this is the baseline. Sorry. And this is the baseline back then, and all the different. So this is the amount coming from agriculture in metric tons a year, natural resources, developed lands, all your stormwater permitting. This is the load allocation. So here's the goal. We're going for a net reduction of 212.4 metric tons per year. And these are the reductions you're supposed to get by sector. So obviously the biggest one is agriculture is supposed to be down at minus 55% of what it was up here. The next biggest one is natural resources. And of course, we're getting some base load reductions from others. But this over the course of now, which is we've got 10 years to get to our 2036 targets set by EPA 10 years ago. So we are actually at the midway point of going between the two pie charts there. And this is where we are. I mean, we're at the midway point for 2036. As of last year in the 2024 performance report, we had 54.7 metric tons of reduction. The goal of 212. So we are a quarter way through our goal at the midway point of 2036. The next report is due January the 15th, so there'll be updated numbers in about a week or so. But to explain both of these, these are the reductions that we've seen so far. As you can see, there's been some plateauing, even some reductions with agriculture. DEC, the Water Investment Division, who crunches all of these numbers, will explain that there is a little bit of a lagging indicator in terms of, you know, them getting some of the numbers in from projects and programs and different reductions and calculations from the regulatory. So actually the estimated reports between 23 is the squares and 24. So there is a bit of a lagging indicator, kind of, how was it put? Well, the jobs report. You get the jobs report comes out in, you know, any specific month, and a couple months later they go, well, we've adjusted it a little bit. That's sort of the adjustment. But still, even with the adjustment, we're at about 57. So we need to consider how well the programs are working, how well the money is being spent, and whether or not some of this needs to be reconsidered. In the different programs by sector, this has become one of my more favorite charts. There's a lot of lines here, but these are the agricultural projects and practice types being used to lower phosphorus discharge. And most of these have been implemented, a lot of them by the required agricultural practices in 2018. So we're coming on about 8 years of the RAPs being in place. And you saw from the other program that some of the agriculture discharges was starting to plateau a little bit. Are the RAPs effective? Is the money being effective? Do they need more money? Does the money need to be spent in better areas? What impacts are drought or flooding having on the required agricultural practices in terms of discharge, and are they, are they being effective? Stormwater, you've gotten into some of this last year and talked about it a little bit, in terms of the various programs. Last year, you talked about the 3-acre stormwater program, which I'm sure will come up again in another couple of years. There's also the half-acre for new development, the full acre requirements for redevelopment. That stormwater, you'll see down here in natural resources, there's a lot of the natural resources that haven't been fully implemented yet, but are in progress. And a lot of it has to do with flooding. Floodplain and stream restorations, river corridor easements, wetlands restoration, wetlands easements. There's a number of these programs that will not only deal with the erosion factor that goes into the phosphorus TMDL, but we're also getting back into the interrelation between water quality and water quantity. We'll deal with a lot of the flooding issues. Some of this was overlapped with the Flood Safety Act in dealing with river corridors and wetlands restorations and a lot of those provisions. It's a little, disturbing is not the right word. It's a little concerning. The natural resources provisions are not in place quite yet this far along. That some of the stormwater provisions aren't in place quite yet. There is a hope that, everything will pick up a little bit, but they have a long way to go by 2036. And I'm sure at some point when DEC comes in, they can better explain all of this than I can. But I think we've gotten to a point in terms of oversight where, this body should go in and look at the RAPs, look at some of the natural resources provisions. You spent some time on 3-acre last year, creating the stakeholder utility group that has been meeting diligently monthly to talk about these issues and talk about the 3-acre provisions. I think it's a good opportunity for this committee to sort of start peeling the onion a little bit and seeing what's working and what's not working. Maybe some need adjustments. Maybe they're doing fine. They just need more time. But it's concerning at about the midway through, we're only a quarter of a way to our goal in phosphorus reduction for Lake Champlain.
Can you talk a little bit about how we measure that? And then also what these status words mean, like implemented, not yet established. I mean, they seem kind of vague and like, so does
Yes.
that mean like if agricultural riparian buffers have been implemented, every farm has them? I know that's not true.
No, I think it's
What does that mean implemented?
I think it means that there is a program in place that they are doing accounting to take it into production. I don't think it necessarily means that there is a buffer in place at every single farm. I think there's a program in place.
Someone could voluntarily use it, or so then, but then like,
And in terms of the accounting, I know that's very complicated in terms of how there's a lot of methodology and a lot of projections in terms of
yeah, I think
in terms of regulatory projects.
Testimony on it last year. We'll have them in again to do that, but I just didn't.
Yeah, so there's
It's
goals.
actually measured versus modeled.
There's a lot of modeling.
Yeah.
So in order to meet the certain reductions annually that they're projected, there's a regulatory amount of the regulatory practices and programs, and then there's non-regulatory projects that Act 76 makes up. And I think there's various, I know for the non-regulatory, it's a lot of methodology in terms of if we plant 5 acres of riparian buffers, it's going to reduce this amount of phosphorus over the course of X number of years. And that's all projected, and that's all in terms of, methodology more than we can go out and measure the exact specific phosphorus reduction. Now they do, DEC monitoring does go out into the field, and they do have through La Rosa program, they measure phosphorus in rivers and streams as sort of, but it's a combination of accounting methods that I think DEC, Emily Bird and her folks are really the best to explain exactly how they calculate all of that.
Understanding these status of accounting. Go ahead, Representative Miller.
Yeah, I just had a question. Do you happen to know, Jared, if the phosphorus reductions that are calculated and shown on the chart, 2 charts previous to this, does it matter how much water? In other words, how in terms of the quality and quantity relationship here, if you have a drought year, so less water is flowing into the lake, therefore, does that mean it's going to carry less phosphorus and therefore your reductions are less or greater? Or you know how
Mm.
quantity affects quality in the measurement of reduction? If you get a flood year or you get a drought year,
Well, in a flood year, you're certainly getting, I think it does. Yes, obviously, because
does a flood year
Let's-
kind of kill your?
yes, let's take
reduction?
agriculture as an example. If you have a drought, you have less rain falling on the farm field, so you have less runoff going into the river, so you have less phosphorus. I think it doesn't really matter if the, you know, the level of the water and the, you know, it still carries the same amount of phosphorus. You just have less runoff. But I've got a chart I think it's a little further along that shows in the 2023 floods, the amount of phosphorus discharged into Lake Champlain over the course of a couple of days was a year's work.
Right, so how does that affect our reduction toward the TMDL? Does it count or does it not count? I mean, yeah, I just don't know if you know the answer to that.
It would count, but I think it's, you know, if I guess you could argue if we had 10 years of drought, we'd probably have a lot less phosphorus runoff running into the lake.
Yeah, that's kind of like,
Yeah.
how does quantity and quality relate when we're counting reductions?
So we will,
Quantities flowing in, but reductions from some standards.
yeah. We'll have, I mean, Neil Cameron from DEC is going to be with us on Thursday afternoon. Can get his help with these.
Yeah, and this gets again into some of it in terms of water quantity. You know, this is one of the charts from, like you said, July 10th through and 11th from 2023. With the amount of water that got deposited, you know, you're seeing these are the flows. So this was the daily. This is from Matt Vaughn, who is up at Lake Champlain Basin Program, and it does a lot of this. This is the phosphorus discharge into the lake. You have 1.7, 5.4 metric tons delivered on July 11th alone by his calculations. And that's a lot. That blows the phosphorus budget pretty well out of the water, so to speak. So when you're taking into account the water quality and quantity, how do you slow this down? How do you prevent these massive amounts of water discharge coming off of, say, you know, 3 inches of rain coming into a 3-acre parcel and slow that water down so it infiltrates into the ground rather than all running into the surface water? How do the RAPs need to be adjusted to address water quantity as well as water quality in terms of runoff coming off of the farm field? So I think there's ways to look at both programs. This is obviously the drought chart from last year. So I wanted to try to find one that was a little more, you know, inches oriented over the course of a couple of years. Could we find one that explained like 23, 24, you know, the 2 rainfalls? But I couldn't. I had to settle for something that was a little broader, but it does show the drought impacts throughout Vermont and then going up into New England. So the Vermont Resilience Implementation Strategy that was developed by the governor and by the treasurer does get into some of this priority items to look at the programs of co-benefits of. So how do you look at our current water quality programs funded by the Clean Water Fund and have water quantity, flood resilience as a co-benefit? And how do you incorporate those two together? I think there's some ways to look at the Clean Water Initiative, the Clean Water Fund, and some of those programs and say, well, if we can start doing more projects that also will help reduce runoff, that will help not only the phosphorus discharge, but the quantity of water that's running. And there's a lot of different items here. Section 15 of the Vermont Resilience Implementation Strategy does have some suggestions of, you know, revising project selections and scoring on how projects are done and how projects are prioritized. That focuses on flood resilience. This is getting down into the weeds more of Act 64 and Act 76 of relating of how we take the Clean Water Fund and expand it so it is doing the benefits of flood resilience as well as phosphorus reduction. And I think that's something that needs to be looked at in terms of not only attacking these two problems at the same time, but also that more and more we're seeing a limited pot of money that needs to be stretched further and further. So how can we make it so it does both? I know DEC has been considering some of this on different levels. I wish DEC would consider it in some other areas. in some spots, they're, they've had a program for a while and they seem to be wedded to it, rather than wanting to tinker with it. But in some spots, I think they're willing to start tinkering and making some changes to some of their programs. And I think that's worth exploring to address both problems, quality and quantity. So that's sort of a broad brushstrokes on sort of a complicated problem. Two other issues that are coming up this year, and I'll turn it over to John as it's getting along in the day. The chloride reduction bill is currently down in Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. It finished the end of the year on the wall, but it is very similar to the bill that this committee discussed and that was voted out. One of the provisions that has changed is the liability provision has changed to an affirmative defense. So a slight shift on the defendant and burden, but it still does offer liability protection for commercial applicators. Otherwise, it still has best management practices for applicators, commercial and municipal. It does set the voluntary certification program, so people are not required to do this, but very much encouraged to do so. It has the study on salt and sand storage facilities, their proximity to surface waters, costs and how much it would move. And it does provide that liability protection. I'm hoping that bill will move out of Senate Natural relatively soon, and you will see it again at some point. But it'll probably be as a standalone bill coming out of there. So that is something that has been, it's seen chloride pollution is seen as one of the as one of the more prevalent issues that's coming up. It is something that you see more and more with drought because fluoride gets into groundwater, when it gets spread into the road medians and percolates itself down into the groundwater. When a river level drops, a surface water drops, it starts drawing in the groundwater around it. And so you see chloride, you actually see an increase in chloride concentration during drought when the water level drops. I think at the moment, DEC is working on 7 or maybe up to 8 now TMDLs for specific segments having to do with chloride pollution, in that they are seeing the Sunnyside Brook is in Colchester and is right next to the Costco parking lot. So that is one of the areas that has seen a real spike in chloride, not only acutely but chronically. And so DEC is in the process of playing whack-a-mole of how they're going to lower chloride levels in different stream segments. So obviously this program would allow DEC to approach this from a more statewide level rather than a whack-a-mole level. And this is because the issues with chloride are going to become more and more acute as they go on. So that's one provision. And then the CAFO provision, S-124 passed last year. It is now, I can't remember the act number, 36. And I just will briefly say that DEC and AFM have missed the first 2 deadlines by September 1st of 2025. There's supposed to be a new memorandum of understanding be released for public comment. We haven't seen one. December 15th, 2025, they were supposed to release a CAFO general permit and a notice of intent. We haven't seen one. However, I believe they're asking for an extension on one of those. The stakeholder group has been meeting. The farmers have been meeting separate from the environmental advocates, and we've been sort of hashing through some of the issues. I don't think they're going to meet the February 15th the deadline for the report back to this body. It's a little disappointing. I understand it's a complicated topic, but we're talking about it, and that's another thing I think that ANR and AFM can come in and discuss. By July 1st, they're supposed to have the applications and the individual CAFO permits that ready, so farmers can start applying for permits. But obviously, the stakeholder groups are to discuss exactly what that's going to look like within the parameters of the federal statute and the parameters of S-124. So that hasn't gotten very far since it left this body last May, but it is being worked on.
Representative Austin.
Why are they missing the deadlines? I mean, is it capacity?
I am not gonna, I don't know. It could be capacity, it could be differences of agreement between the two agencies on what should be in the MOU or what should be in the general permit. It could be just, wanting to make sure that the Ts are crossed and the Is are dotted before they issue something. But they haven't shared with us on why, or at least not that I've heard, why the delays, particularly in like the MOU. That's the end for me. I'll hand it over to John
Thank you.
if there's no more questions.
Thanks, Jared. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me in on day one. I really appreciate it. I really do. The opportunity to talk about some of the issues we're focused on this year. So just as a reminder, I'm John Groveman. I'm the Policy and Water Program Director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council. I'm not going to go through all my background again, but I always love listening to Mike talk because I think we've been doing this for as long as each other, basically. And I've worked for ANR, been the general counsel there, working with Mike. I used to manage what was the Water Resources Board that used to adopt the water quality standards and the wetland rules in the state. And I've had the privilege of working with Mike and many other people over those years. So I've been around these water issues for a really long time. And I'm gonna, as I said, I'll talk about some of the issues that we're focused on this year, but happy to answer questions about, we're involved with most of the things that Mike had gone over. I don't know how many of those issues are gonna come up in the legislature this year, but happy to answer questions today or anytime that you want to delve into those issues. But really our focus this year, we don't have a lot of new initiatives. There's a chloride bill that Jared noted, and there's a bill that we call a restoration bill that I'll talk about really briefly in a second. But for the most part, we really want to make sure we stay on track implementing the measures that you as a body have already passed. And in particular, with regard to water, that's the Flood Safety Act and some parts of Act 181. And the sort of common denominator is that the Flood Safety Act, it was obviously in response to the extreme flooding that we've seen over a number of years in Vermont, and it called for improved wetland protection. It called for regulation of development in river corridors. So the questions that you asked about the wetland maps and the river corridor maps, and Mike answered. So that's all in play still and being implemented through regulations at the agency. And we want to make sure we stay on track with those issues. And one component of Act 181, and Act 181 was as you know, the major overhaul of our land use planning laws in the state. It created the Land Use Review Board. And so that is sort of the common denominator. We want to make sure that we meet our deadlines, and I'm going to talk about some other deadlines that haven't been met just to get them on your radar screen. And I agree with Jared. I think, the question of like, why are deadlines being missed and what's happening? I think we're relying on your committee and the legislature to do some oversight and to ask these questions, because we can't get answers. We don't know the answers to the questions, but we want to see these programs implemented. So let me go over some specifics, and I'll start with wetlands. So under the Flood Safety Act, so the Flood Safety Act had three main parts. How do we do a better job at mitigating the impacts of flood? So let's protect wetlands better. It's indisputable that basically since we've been measuring development and impacts on wetlands, we've lost 35% of the wetlands in Vermont, and that's consistent with across the whole country, because for decades and decades and decades, really up until we had the Clean Water Act, as Mike went over, we were just allowing development. We weren't regulating water quality issues, including wetlands. So we lost, at least 35% of our wetlands. Wetlands are incredible ecological features. They are nature's way of naturally holding back floodwater. They are nature's way of naturally filtering pollutants. You know, modern planning techniques in cities across the country is, you know, step one is, yes, you could build stormwater infrastructure and other infrastructure to deal with mitigating flood waters and to mitigating pollution from stormwater. But the first thing you do is leave the wetlands to do what nature had created them to do in the first place. So the Flood Safety Act said, we're going to set a policy in Vermont, recognizing we've lost up to 35% of our wetlands. We're going to have a net gain policy of wetlands. We want to actually claw back some of the losses that we've seen over the years because we know how effective wetlands are in dealing with floodwaters and pollution. And even in our developed areas, we've seen the devastation that flooding has caused, whether it's in Barry City, whether it's in downtown Plainfield, whether it's in Lyndonville, you know, we can go on, but it's not, there are plenty of flood damage in even our growth areas that wetlands helps to mitigate. So on implementing the Flood Safety Act provisions of the wetland provisions of the Flood Safety Act, ANR has missed the deadline. They were supposed to, I think, have a rule out by this July, and they have not done that. And instead, they've been working on implementing the governor's executive order that you heard Michael discuss. So from our perspective, they've gone in the wrong direction. They haven't implemented the net gain policies. And actually, there were some mapping improvements that I think everybody supports better mapping of wetlands. That was part of the Flood Safety Act. That hasn't happened. And instead, the rule that Michael went over with you is actually a proposed rule. So it's in the rulemaking process now. And that rule would do what Michael said. It would allow exemptions for housing in certain growth areas and allow impacts of wetlands that right now under Vermont law are not allowed. It's been really difficult for us to kind of analyze the different proposals that the administration and ANR have come up with regard to wetlands because they haven't really identified the problem. And what I mean by that is, and we've had a number of meetings and we've asked the questions, and I would encourage you all to ask the question. And the question we've asked is, well, what evidence do you have that even in these growth areas that wetlands are a significant barrier to building housing? And we've heard some anecdotes. We've heard a couple of anecdotes, but not really a body of evidence that says, well, this is systematically what we're seeing as a problem with regard to how the wetland program is being run in Vermont, and it's having this impact on housing. So I think that's an area that's ripe for this committee to get into. But even putting that to the side, you know, we did raise concerns about the executive order, similar to the concerns that Legislative Counsel and the AG's office had raised. And now we're kind of beyond that, and we're looking at the proposed rule. And I'll just go over, the comments are due on the proposed rule next week. So we're actually putting together our formal comments. But here's some of our concerns with the proposed rule. And they do mirror a number of things that Mike had said. So one concern we have is that we're weakening wetland protection. And that seems to be counter to the Flood Safety Act. The Flood Safety Act said a net gain policy in statute, and we're going to allow for greater wetland impact. So we want to understand how the proposal is consistent with the statute that the legislature passed 2 years ago. As Michael said, we have significant concerns that they don't have the legal authority, ANR doesn't, to create these broad allowed uses or exemptions for wetlands. My analysis is really exactly the same as Michael. There are allowed uses, exemptions in the wetland rules, but they're for small impacts. They're literally for things like mowing a lawn or having a barbecue pit, like just practical, really de minimis activities that I think that the state, through the wetland rules, wanted to say, no, you don't need a permit for those kind of really small activities. There are also some allowed uses for, like, the only thing that is more significant is for utility projects and for some road projects. And the rationale there is those are linear projects. So even though they could be more significant, you know, they're along a corridor. And even with those exemptions, there are best management practices that both V-Trans and utility companies need to follow to protect wetlands. Housing projects are, it's completely unprecedented. They're much broader. They could be a giant house, a giant housing project. It could have roads and driveways, and it's like one of these things is not like the other. But more importantly, legally, and I think this gets to, I think the question that Representative North was raising earlier, which is that our read on the statute is the wetland statute, the whole purpose of that statute is to protect wetland functions and values. And the secretary may make decisions if based on a functions and values analysis, a wetland shouldn't be class 2 or a buffer should be diminished. But you can't, in our reading of the law, is just without doing that functional analysis, just say because of this type of project in these type of areas, because we want these type of projects in these type of areas, we're going to basically skip that functional analysis. We're not going to know if there are wetlands that aren't mapped that are providing flood benefits, water quality benefits. We're just going to say you could build in them. That is not consistent with the statute. And if the administration wants to pursue this, and we have policy concerns about that, which I'll note a few of them in a second, we think they have to come to you to change the statute. And that's going to be part of our comment on the rule, that this is beyond the authority of a state agency to basically override the statute with the rule. If people want to change how the functional analysis is applied, if they want to carve out areas and growth areas, we could have that debate. But the rule, we think, is bypassing the legislature, and the authority is not there. And we also do have concerns with how they're defining growth areas. It's not limited. We think if we're going to have a discussion, again, difficult to have because we don't really fully understand the problem. We do think it's really important to understand the problem that people are having. But if there is an issue in the growth areas where we said we want growth areas where housing will be facilitated, that's the Land Use Review Board's process of reviewing the plans and the maps and creating the Tier 1B areas and drawing those maps. We think that the discussion should be limited to those areas because there's a planning effort underway right now, including looking at natural resources in those areas, including wetlands and river corridors. But the way that the rule is written, the wetland exemption would apply in something that's called an opportunity zone, which we don't have yet in Vermont, to my knowledge. I think there's a federal designation, sewer service areas, basically. And so where sewer lines run could be well beyond like what the Land Use Review Board would say is a discrete growth area. So anyway, so there are those sort of policy issues as well. But we'll be following our comments. We'll send our comments to you. But we do think that there are some significant legal issues, with A&R's rulemaking proposal. And I would say again, just for emphasis, that it's just not smart to build in wetlands. Like even we have the flood impacts, and wetlands do mitigate floods. So the flooding that's happened in those growth centers that we have now, the wetlands have helped. We don't know how much we help. We haven't analyzed where these wetlands are, what their functions are, how much they're helping prevent flood damage. But just putting the flood issues aside, you don't want to build in a wetland. You don't want to put a septic system in a wetland. You don't want to put your foundation in a wetland. It's going to lead to problems for the person who's doing the building down the road. And good planning is not to just torture people. It's to basically avoid these future impacts and to build smart. So we just don't think it's wise to allow people to build in areas that are wetlands that could be highly functional wetlands just because they're not on a map. And that's very arbitrary. Some of the practical issues, even if the A&R rule went through, it doesn't do anything with federal permitting. There's still federal wetland permitting that would exist. So you could actually be creating uncertainty for developers. They could say, oh, I don't have to do anything because there's this new state rule, but they have to go to the Army Corps of Engineers. There are towns and their bylaws that may have wetland restrictions. So, and then there's this really practical issue of the maps are being upgraded and changing. So you could plan a project, get funding for a project, and the wetland's not on the map, so you have this A&R rule and you go, great, I'm good to go in terms of state wetland permitting, but maybe you don't get around to building it for another year because there's often a lag of time between like planning and hiring people and building the project. And then over that time, what happens? The maps get updated and now there is a wetland. And so now you do have to deal with it. I mean, you've done all this planning, spent all this money, and now you're going to have to maybe redo things because of it. So there's some practical, I'm not sure if the state has thought through like all of the practical implications of implementing this executive order, which is intended to provide some sort of facilitation of these projects. It could end up creating uncertainty and some problems for people. So that's the wetland part of the Flood Safety Act and the executive order. In terms of the Flood Safety Act also, we're supposed to be developing a river corridor permitting and regulation. So we're not building in these river corridors. So we're not putting new development and infrastructure in harm's way. That rule is delayed. That deadline has been missed. I think it was the same. Was it the same deadline? Was it the river corridor permitting? Was that July?
There's several of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, but those have been missed as well.
And then Mike noted the dam, there's a dam safety rule component to it that also that deadline has been missed, and we can send you the specific dates. And with regard to the river corridor permitting, I just want to note that we're not doing anyone any favors by letting people continue to build in these areas. It's going to create more harm to people's anything they build there potentially, and the infrastructure, and more cost to try to remediate it. So it creates just more expense and liability and safety issues for people. And we understand, that there's it takes time to go through these things, but delay, especially with regard to those issues, is really harming everybody. And if we slip, I think that there is a provision in the A&R miscellaneous bill to move some of the river deadlines back a year. And if it slips, that's disappointing. But if it slipped more than that, I think it's really putting everybody at a significant disadvantage. But that's another issue that I think your committee could ask those questions and to try to keep people on track. And the last keeping on track issue has to do with Act 181. So Act 181 has many components to it. I mentioned the component of developing the growth area maps. Those are the tier 1B maps of where housing could occur and you'd be exempt from Act 250. Tier 1A are areas where there'd be mapped areas where you'd be exempt for Act 250 from both commercial, industrial, and residential development. So those maps are being developed through the Land Use Review Board. The Land Use Review Board is also under Act 181, creating a rule to protect critical natural resources. And these are what's known as the Tier 3 areas. And there's been a stakeholder process, VNRC, and many, many other stakeholders have been involved. Through that process, the Land Use Review Board has identified 3 critical natural resources to be part of this rule: headwaters and habitat connectors and special natural areas. And so I'm going to focus on the headwaters part of it. So there's a lot of benefit in terms of water that really could connect to the river corridors. The LURB, the Land Use Review Board, is developing these headwater maps that if it's done right, it could really connect, like we could protect the river corridors, and then we could protect sort of the headwater areas that are sort of the more sensitive streams. And it could begin to kind of weave together a resilience picture for water resources in Vermont, where we're making sure we're not developing in a way that is, putting infrastructure and development in harm's way and harming these critical natural resources. That's not off track yet. They haven't missed deadlines on that. We just flagging that as just another really important issue to stay on track with, and you should have the Land Use Review Board in here to talk about it. But I mentioned it because I think all these things together, it's important to stay on track with getting the wetland rules adopted, not the A&R proposed rule, but the one that was required by the Flood Safety Act. Get that back on track, try to get on track with the river corridor permitting, and then you have the headwaters component. And then we're beginning, I think, to achieve the vision of Act 181 and the Flood Safety Act of kind of having this broader protection. And the last thing I'll mention is the only bill proposal that that VNRC and some of the other water groups in the state are pushing, in addition to what Jared mentioned, is what we're calling a restoration bill. And basically, all the flooding that we've seen over the years, combined with just the way we've developed, we've developed, this is how we got the Flood Safety Act, right? We've developed along all our river systems. That's where we put a lot of, where our main roads are. That's where our villages are. It's put, it's put our communities in harm's way. It's harmed those natural resources. So basically, it's a bill to facilitate, it's defining an ecological restoration project, and they're going to be things like dam safety projects. It's going to be things like shoreline restoration. It's going to be things like floodplain restoration, culvert replacement, and try to have a process at ANR where there's better coordination and facilitation of those projects, because those projects, they don't harm the natural resources at the end of the day. They're actually improving natural resources protection and function. And so the state doesn't really have a lens to look at those projects that's different than sort of other projects that they review. Other states do have categories of restoration projects where they have a more coordinated response to those. And so we see this as just another way to go kind of hand in hand with protecting river corridors and wetlands and headwaters, but being able and fixing our dams, many that were harmed during the floods that we've had over the last number of years, as a way to sort of facilitate those projects, which we think we need more and more of these days. So yeah, so that's the high level. Happy to answer any questions.
Members have questions? Representative Austin?
Well, I'm just concerned about the oversight and, meeting deadlines. And I feel like people need to meet deadlines, or there needs to be a reason, a rationale why they're not, and that needs to be addressed. But you just can't have people or agencies not, being responsible for meeting the deadlines of these laws. So I'm just concerned about that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I might have no other answer than the one that Jared gave, but that's why I think the good news is that, so Michael mentioned the anti-degradation rule deadline that was from 2016. So, I think we're mentioning this now so we don't end up we don't want to end up 10 years from now. And I don't think we will, but I think it's important. And these were 2 years ago that these bills passed. Like, we're really fresh in it. And I think and we're still dealing with climate change, and we will for the rest of our lives. And so these things are not going to get better. We're going to get more floods. We're going to get more droughts. We're going to get more of all these situations. So I think this is a good time for the legislature, having just passed these initiatives, and really understand them, to ask those questions and try to get the agencies on track and see what they need, to basically meet these deadlines. But that's one of the reasons we're calling it out
Good.
before it slips too far.
Representative Sakowicz.
Yeah. John, can you talk a little bit about how we actually regulate development in wetlands I guess what I'm wondering is, if you're somebody who wants to do some sort of project, how does it actually work? Like, how is it flagged that you need to figure out, whether you're in a wetland or not, and what's the process you need to go through? I guess I really just don't understand how that works at all.
Well, I mean, I think so. The first thing is, you certainly, if you hire someone to build your project, if you build it yourself, which you can do, which I know you've done, either way, you want to make sure that you deal with all the permitting issues that you have. So with regard to wetlands, I think the first thing you do is go to the wetland maps and you look at the maps, but you also walk your property, right? And if you go to the wetland maps and there's a wetland over here that's mapped, there's a wetland over here that's mapped, but nothing there. But you walk the property and it's wet, feels like it's wet, or that it's wet, for certain times of the year. You might see some vegetation. You would call the wetland. It's incumbent on you. It's your responsibility to call the wetlands office and say, or hire, have your contractor or someone who's an expert come out and advise you to make sure that you're staying out of the wetland areas. And then if you you have a wetland issue, you call the wetland office, and it's wise to have them come out and to, say, they could do it through a desktop review as well. It looks like this part of your property is clearly out of the wetland. This is in it. And if you have any questions and you might be in a wetland or a wetland buffer, you really kind of have to interact with the wetland office. Unless it could be very clear from the map and just from actually being on the property that it's an upland area, it's not a wetland area, it's dry. And it's very clear that you're not going to have a wetland issue. So, I mean,
Yeah, that's interesting. So like you point out, I built the house. It was a long time ago. I had no idea there were wetland rules when I built my house. I wouldn't have known.
Right.
And it's easy to imagine, it was not a problem, but it's easy to imagine that I could have put my structure within the limits of where a wetland says, where our law says we can't put buildings. It seems like there'd be nothing to prevent it from happening. Like I don't need to get a permit that says, oh, you're definitely out of a wetland. I only need a permit if I think I'm going to, right? Like,
I mean, it's an enforcement issue if somebody calls it out. That's only if you're obviously in a wetland. Like people won't know. Like if you're on the edge of, like, if you're 2 feet within a 50-foot buffer, and it's a fairly dry area, but or you have a problem because there's something with your foundation, or you're seeing some water accumulate, but it really is it's really an enforcement issue. It's not, state doesn't have an army of people out there going out and inspecting every property. But the prudent thing to do, and that's why it's really if you're on the map, and that's a good indication that you might have some wetland issues, and I think Vermonters are smart. Like they don't want to build in wet areas for all the reasons that it's not smart to build in wet areas. So, but the maps, that's why the maps are so important. But it's just that there are things that are not on the map, as Michael explained. And most people do hire someone to help them build. Contractors are pretty good. Everyone's going to need, unless you're connecting to sewer, you're going to need a septic system. You're doing perk tests. People who do that are pretty good. You don't want to put a septic system in a wetland; it will fail. So they avoid that. So there's lots of I think parts of the process of building something where flags would occur, where if you're smart and responsible, you'll reach out.
do we have a sense that that's sort of ad hoc and system seems to work fairly well?
I mean, I could always work better. I mean, I think we're never going to have enough people to police the entire state. I think as the maps get better, really is the answer, and that's part of the Flood Safety Act. You want to get to a point where the maps, they'll never be perfect, but that's the way to really reach the most people.
You have to know to check the map, right? You have to
Yeah,
know
yeah,
that
but
it
it's the
makes
easier
sense.
thing to do, and that is, I would hope that anyone building anything at this point, you go on the Natural Resources Atlas, and Vermont Conservation has so much information on there now. It's pretty easy. And I've been on my local planning commission for years. We have, people who are just subdividing land, and, they'll come in and most of them will say, hey, you should go on the app. We'll do it for them. We'll sit there and just look up, the atlas and show them. But a lot of people, I think, do have that wherewithal, and more people are going to have it. But it's never going to be perfect. But improving the maps is, I think, we all agree, there's universal agreement on that. And that, again, that was part of the Flood Safety Act. But because they're not perfect, just basically saying that we're just going to ignore if it's an obvious wetland that's not on the map, where most people would know not to build there, that, you shouldn't build there. But I mean, I think Vermont's system, most states that have wetland regulations don't have any maps that create permitting jurisdiction. A lot of states actually use, and when the Water Resources Board exists, we actually went through a whole process with this. It's one of the functions of not having strong county government in Vermont. So in a lot of states, like Massachusetts, for example, they rely on their county government to do a lot of this work in terms of like, assisting people with development. Regional planning commissions could provide that function a little bit in Vermont. But, it's just the function of Vermont being small, but that I think we use maps for jurisdiction. I think we're the only state that does that at all. In other states that have their own wetland programs, they're basically relying on building professionals, county government, to basically work with landowners to identify and avoid wetland impacts.
How long has Vermont been regulating wetlands this way?
How long?
Oh,
The wetland rules went into effect in 1990. The wetlands law was passed in 1989. And it was based on, I was asked by a reporter this recently. I do remember, having worked at the Water Resources Board, I do know this history, but basically it was a lot of scientists, including academics and people from the agency, saying we should regulate wetlands based on functions and values. 50-foot buffer was a minimum. That was like the science, was the literature is really clear that if you're not, protecting the area around a wetland, that you could really impair the functions and values. But they wanted to leave the flexibility to have was mostly like a wider or smaller buffer, but they wanted the functional analysis because it was really a science-based statute. And then in 1990, the Water Resources Board adopted the wetland rules that included the process for classifying and reclassifying wetlands and altering buffers and classifying class 1 wetlands, as Michael noted. So the system has been in place for now 35 years. It's been tweaked a bit as we went because we got rid of the Water Resources Board, and we actually tried to streamline the reclassification process, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. And that's where the goal was to make it easier to either take wetlands that Michael mentioned that shouldn't be on the map, that are farm ponds or swimming pools, off the map, but also to put wetlands that we knew on the ground were wetlands that didn't get caught by the mapping. And the initial mapping, I should mention, was aerial mapping from the federal government. So they missed a lot, right? They were like flew over the state. And that's the National Wetland Inventory maps. So all the forested wetlands, they missed, right? They couldn't see them, even in anywhere that there was just too many trees. And then depending on the time of year they went, also affected that. But since then, it's really been, you have conservation commissions out there getting grants to do like wetlands mapping. We've really added to the wetlands maps. And the Flood Safety Act was just the latest attempt to basically infuse more resources to do that. But it's a pretty unique approach that we have in Vermont, but I think anything could be improved. We could talk about how to improve it, but I think we realize we need to protect these wetland areas, especially in these times of flooding. It's just not something we want to make weaker or harder to protect. If there's a problem, we've said, well, what's happening on the ground that has spurred this effort that people are running into roadblocks in a systemic way? Like, we've heard one or two stories, and I'm not diminishing the impact of those stories on the people who experience those stories, but we're looking for what's systemically not working, sort of what Representative Sakowicz is asking systemically how this works. But I would encourage you to have the wetland ecologists in, not the A&R, commissioners and deputy commissioners, but have the people who are implementing the program, and they could answer your question best of all.
further questions? Thanks so much for your.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.